The meeting room on the fifth floor of the Mossad building in Tel Aviv had no windows, a deliberate feature for spaces where decisions of irreversible consequences were made. 4 people sat at the mahogany table: Chief Operating Officer Zvi Zamir, Senior Analyst Rachel Alon, Special Operations Commander Ehud Barak, and David Kimche, head of the Political Intelligence Division. It was March 1976, almost 4 years after the Munich bombings that had shocked the world and turned the Olympic Games into a scene of tragedy. 11 Israeli athletes killed, live television coverage broadcasting horror in real time. And behind the operation, a strategic mind that remained free: Ali Hassan Salami. "He's not just a target," Zamir began, pushing a bulky dossier across the table. "It is symbolic of everything that failed in our initial response, and every day that remains free is a public reminder of that failure." Rachel opened the dossier, even though she already knew its contents from memory. Ali Hassan Salame, born in 1940 in a Palestinian village destroyed after 1948. Father killed in combat when Ali was 8 years old. Raised by his mother in a refugee camp in Lebanon, formally educated beyond what was ordinary, fluent in Arabic, English, and French. But biography didn't capture what made Salami particularly dangerous: his strategic mindset. While many Palestinian militants operated with ideological passion and improvised planning, Salami treated operations as engineering projects, calculating variables, anticipating responses, building redundancies. "Munich wasn't an emotional outburst," Rachel said, flipping through psychological analyses. "It was a calculated demonstration of Western vulnerability. He chose the Olympic Games specifically because they would ensure maximum global coverage. Every decision, timing, location, execution, was optimized for psychological and political impact." Ehud Barak, an operations veteran who rarely showed emotion, allowed a somber expression to cross his face. "And since then, he has systematically avoided us. 3 attempts to capture failed. The Lillehammer disaster. No one needed him to complete it. Lillehammer, Norway, 1973. Poorly planned operation resulting in the death of an innocent civilian mistaken for Salami. International scandal. Agents arrested. Mossad methods publicly exposed. Not only operational failure, but a public relations disaster that strengthened Salame's position by demonstrating that even a legendary organization like Mossad made fatal mistakes." "The problem," David Kimche interjected with the analytical tone that defined his approach, "is that Salami has learned from our mistakes better than we have. He knows how we operate because he has observed our attempts. It avoids predictable patterns, constantly varies routes, maintains an extremely limited circle of trust." Rachel nodded, pointing to a specific section of the dossier. "And there is an additional complication that makes direct action politically risky. Western intelligence indicates that it serves as an informal conduit between the PLO and the CIA." Zamir raised an eyebrow. "Does he work for Americans?" "It doesn't work," Rachel corrected. "It makes it easier, provides information about regional extremist groups that the CIA cannot access directly. It is a mutually beneficial relationship that makes Salame valuable to Washington, even as it recognizes his role in Munich." The implication hung in the air. Eliminating Salame could have diplomatic repercussions beyond the usual condemnations. It could damage a critical relationship with Israel's greatest ally. "So, what is the proposal?" Ehud asked directly. Zamir leaned back in his chair, fingers clasped together. "Capture, not elimination. We want Salami alive in custody, available for interrogation that can dismantle entire networks, and we want to do this in a way that minimizes political repercussions. Target capture of this sophistication, operating in hostile territory, with protection from multiple factions." Ehud left sentence incomplete, obvious implications. "I know it's hard," Zamir said. "Lillehammer proved that rash actions end in catastrophe, but the continuity of Salame Livre erodes our strategic credibility. We need a solution that balances operational effectiveness with political feasibility." Rachel began to outline what they knew about Salami's current operations. Based in Beirut, he maintained multiple residences that rotated unpredictably. He traveled in trains with trained security guards. It avoided electronic communications that could be intercepted. Socially, it circulated among the Lebanese elite. Dinners, cultural events, political circles that made conventional military action unfeasible due to the risk of civilian casualties. He has built life that is simultaneously public and inaccessible, she concluded. Visible enough to demonstrate that it does not hide, protected enough to make it extremely difficult to approach. David added political dimension, and Lebanon is in a delicate balance. Intermittent civil war, multiple factions, growing Syrian presence. An obvious Israeli operation could destabilize the situation even more, which paradoxically could strengthen groups that we want to weaken. Ehud studied maps of Beirut scattered on the table. So we need an operation that seems not to be an operation. That captures Salami without leaving an obvious Israeli fingerprint. That minimizes collateral and maximizes plausible deniability. It's not impossible, Zamir said carefully, but it requires patience that goes against instinct for quick response. We are talking about an operation that can take years to set up properly. Rachel asked a question that everyone was thinking. What if during these years Salami orchestrates another attack of Munich's magnitude? Silence weighed on the room. It was a central dilemma of every long-term operation against an active target. Time required to set up sophisticated capture versus the risk of allowing the target to continue operating. So, Zamir finally said, we worked on two fronts. We develop long-term capture operation. Simultaneously, we maintain intensive vigilance to detect and prevent any imminent attack planning. If we identify an immediate threat, we respond accordingly. But the primary objective remains a live catch. Ehud waved slowly. I will need a specialized team. Not conventional operators, but people who can work in a complex urban environment, maintain coverage for months, perform with surgical precision when the window opens. You'll have the necessary resources, Zamir promised. This is a top priority, but I want meticulous planning before any move. We can't afford another Lillehammer. The meeting continued for another 3 hours, outlining initial parameters. Rachel would coordinate intelligence, mapping Salami patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, developing human sources in Beirut. Ehud would begin selection and training of operational staff. David would work out the political angle, ensuring that when capture happened, there would be an international legal framework to prosecute Salami without creating a diplomatic crisis. When they finally dispersed, Rachel remained, studying Salami's photograph attached to the dossier. Attractive man, well-dressed, confident but not arrogant. He could easily be a successful businessman or a mid-level diplomat. But she knew what was behind that facade. She lies that she had orchestrated Munich, that she continued to plan operations that combined violence with a political message, that she saw terrorism not as an emotional explosion, but as a strategic tool for long-term goals. Capturing it would be not only an operational victory, but a symbolic one. It would demonstrate that even the most sophisticated eventually faced consequences. That strategic patience overcame tactical bravado. But first, they needed to find a loophole in defenses that Salami had built up over the years, learning from each previous attempt, adapting to each change in the security environment. It was a game of patience, and Rachel, studying that confident face, was determined to beat him. Beirut, 1976, was a city of violent contrasts. Elegant avenues where Mercedes and Cadillacs milled between French boutiques and high-end restaurants existed just blocks from neighborhoods destroyed by sectarian fighting. Lebanese civil war had created fragmented urban geography, territories controlled by different factions, makeshift checkpoints, loyalties that shifted weekly. For Mossad operatives, it was both a logistical nightmare and a strategic opportunity. Chaos created cover. Multiple factions meant multiple potential identities. A constant flow of foreigners, journalists, aid workers, opportunistic businessmen. allowed infiltration that would have been impossible in a stable society. Rachel Alon arrived in Beirut in June 1976, traveling on a Canadian passport under the name Sarah Mitchell, a freelance photojournalist documenting the humanitarian impact of the Civil War. Identity had been painstakingly constructed over 6 months, articles published in secondary journals, verifiable portfolio, even Canadian bank account with transaction history. She wasn't there to capture Salami. It was there to map the territory, identify patterns, build infrastructure that would eventually make capture possible. For the first 3 months, Rachel simply lived as Sarah Mitchell would. He photographed ruins, interviewed refugees, attended press briefings. She rented a small apartment in a Christian neighborhood, established a morning coffee routine in the same place, became a familiar presence enough to be ignored. But each movement had a secondary purpose. The cafe he frequented was 3 blocks from one of the residential buildings that Salami occasionally used. The local photographer with whom he collaborated had a cousin who worked in security service near Salami Circles. The secretary of the press agency where she registered credentials had a brother in Fatah. Rachel didn't ask direct questions. It simply existed in the spaces adjacent to Salami's world, absorbing information by social osmosis. In Tel Aviv, Ehud Barak set up a different operational structure. It selected 12 operators, not from conventional elite units, but from diverse backgrounds that would allow for multiple coverages. Former businessman who could circulate in commercial circles, engineer with experience in civil construction, a doctor who had worked in conflict zones, fluent translator in Lebanese dialectal Arabic. Each received intensive training not in combat, though all were proficient, but in maintaining cover under prolonged pressure. How to live false identity for months without micro-expressions of falsehood. How to manage long-term operating stress without compromising effectiveness. Lillehammer's mistake, Ehud said during a training session, was pressure for a quick result. Operators were inserted, performed poorly, and failed spectacularly. This time is our ally. We have no deadline. We only have a goal. So David Kimche worked on a more delicate angle, to build a legal justification for eventual capture that would minimize diplomatic repercussions. He consulted quietly with contacts in the French Justice Department, which also had an interest in prosecuting Salami for attacks on French territory. It explored the possibility of an international Interpol warrant based on multiple charges. If we just take it and bring it to Israel, David explained at a coordination meeting, it will be condemned globally as state kidnapping. But if he is captured under the authority of a recognized international warrant, and Israel is only temporary custody before transfer to appropriate jurisdiction, narrative changes completely. In September 1976, Rachel identified the first real vulnerability. Salame, despite his legendary caution, maintained a fixed routine, bi-weekly dinners in a specific high-end restaurant in a Christian area of Beirut. He didn't always go on the same day, but always in the same establishment. Chez Antoine, known for his discretion and political elite clientele. Rachel began to frequent the restaurant, always in the company of real journalists she had cultivated as contacts. He sat at desks that offered line of sight without being obvious. He observed not only Salami, but his patterns, how many security guards, how they were positioned, routes of arrival and exit with whom he dined. It was during one of these observations that she noticed something critical. Salami varied security guards, but always had the same driver, a man in his 50s with a military posture who waited in the vehicle while Salami dined. Driver is vulnerability, Rachel reported in encrypted communication to Tel Aviv. Long-term relationship suggests trust. If we can compromise the driver, we gain direct access. But compromising did not mean recruiting. It meant to replace. It took 4 months of discreet surveillance to fully map out the driver's life. Mahmoud Bashir, a Palestinian security veteran, married, with 3 children, living in the southern suburbs of Beirut. A man of predictable routines, loyalty demonstrated over years, with no obvious vices or financial vulnerabilities that could be exploited for recruitment. So we didn't recruit him, Ehud said during a planning meeting in January 1977. We create a situation where he temporarily cannot serve, and we insert a substitute. The operation was performed with surgical precision in March 1977. Mahmoud suffered a non-fatal but disabling traffic accident, a perfectly timed collision that resulted in a fractured ankle and rib, requiring a 3-week hospitalization. Police investigation found nothing suspicious. It was simply bad luck in a city where traffic accidents were common. The substitute was already positioned, Mossad operator with extensive training, perfect fluency, background as a professional driver with experience in executive security. It was recommended through channels that Salame trusted, verifiable references, appropriate history, even physical appearance that did not match the usual profile. For 3 weeks while Mahmoud recovered, the substitute, codenamed Yosef, transported Salami. He learned exact patterns, preferences, alternative routes. He gained confidence through quiet competence and professionalism that mirrored Mahmoud's. But more importantly, it mapped precisely how Salami moved, where vulnerabilities existed, and when and where the window for capture could open. When Mahmoud returned to duty, Yosef was discharged with gratitude and appropriate payment. Salame never suspected that for 3 critical weeks, he had entrusted his security to an Israeli agent. The information Yosef brought was transformative. For the first time, they had an inside look at how Salame operated on a tactical level, not theory based on outside observation, but direct knowledge of someone who had sat in the front seat while Salame conducted business. He's cautious, but not paranoid, Yosef reported during extensive debriefing. Trust people who demonstrate consistent competence. Their security guards are professionals, but they work under the assumption that the threat will come from outside. Direct assault, ambush, gun attack. They are not configured to detect internal substitution. Rachel summed up months of intelligence in a presentation she delivered to the leadership in April 1977. We have a window. Not permanent, but real. Salami maintains enough routines that we can predict with reasonable certainty where he will be at specific times. Its security is strong against conventional attacks, but vulnerable to nearby infiltration. If we can create a situation where he is temporarily isolated from his usual protection net, capture is feasible. Zamir studied analysis for a long time. And collateral? Risk to civilians. Minimizable, Ehud replied. If we choose the right location and timing, we can create a containment zone that limits exposure. We didn't eliminate risk completely. That would be impossible in an urban environment. But we can reduce it to acceptable levels. And extraction? It's one thing to capture it, it's another to get him out of Beirut alive and intact. We worked on 3 exfiltration routes, Ehud explained, pointing to detailed maps. Sea, land through Christian-controlled territory, and air if circumstances permit. Each route has redundancies, decision points where we can change plans based on real conditions. David added the legal dimension. France confirmed its willingness to issue an international warrant. Not publicly yet. But when we have Salami in custody, warrant will be activated retroactively. This gives us legal cover that transforms the capture of state kidnapping into the execution of a legitimate warrant. It was complex architecture of deception, timing, and coordination that had taken more than a year to build. And yet success would depend on a window that could open and close in minutes. How long until we're ready for execution? Zamir asked. 6 months to position all the elements, Ehud estimated. Maybe less if Salame cooperates by maintaining predictable routines. Zamir nodded. So we continue. But I want weekly reviews. If at any point the risk becomes unacceptable, we abort. I'd rather leave Salame free for more years than repeat Lillehammer. The operation, now formally designated Caesarea 17, was entering the final stages of preparation, and Ali Hassan Salame, circling Beirut with the confidence of a man who had evaded capture for years, had no idea what an invisible net was slowly closing around him. October 1978 marked a critical moment in Operation Caesarea 17. After more than 2 years of meticulous preparation, gradual infiltration, and continuous mapping, the infrastructure was complete. 6 safe houses in Beirut, 17 verifiable identities, a network of contacts that allowed movement through territories controlled by different factions, and exfiltration routes tested through simulations. But it still lacked an essential element, a window of opportunity where all the variables aligned. Rachel, now deeply embedded in Beirut's journalistic community, kept a discreet watch on Salameh's patterns. He remained cautious but predictable within certain parameters. Bi-weekly dinners at Chez Antoine, occasional meetings at a business office he kept as a front for legitimate businesses, participation in elite Lebanese social events. It was through this last category that opportunity emerged. In November 1978, Rachel learned through contact in diplomatic circles that a charity gala would be held in a luxury hotel in a Christian area of Beirut. The event would bring together the political and business elite, Christians, moderate Muslims, some PLO representatives who maintained acceptable public relations. Salameh, who cultivated an image as a sophisticated and politically connected Palestinian figure, had confirmed his presence. Rachel relayed information immediately. Potential window. High-profile event with externally coordinated security, not just by Salameh's personal team. Multiple entry and exit points. Period of approximately 4 hours where location is predictable. In Tel Aviv, the planning team analyzed each aspect. Ehud called a meeting of all operators stationed in Beirut, 12 people who had lived under cover for months, holding false identities while waiting for a moment that might never come. It's not a perfect window, Ehud admitted during an encrypted briefing held in a safe house. There will be hundreds of civilians present. Security will be multilateral and unpredictable. But it's the first time in years that we have reasonable certainty of where Salameh will be for an extended period. The plan developed was complex and depended on precise coordination through multiple phases. Phase 1. Infiltration. 3 operators would enter the event using established identities. Rachel as a journalist covering a charity gala. Michel as a French businessman with business in Lebanon. Layla as an assistant for an international humanitarian organization. Each would have legitimate access, verified through actual invitations obtained through months of cultivating contacts. Phase 2. Mapping. During the event, operators would map security positions, identify Salameh's movement routes, determine the optimal time for action. Phase 3. Isolation. Create a situation where Salameh would be temporarily separated from her primary security. That would require subtle coordination, not something obvious like a false alarm that would alert everyone, but a sequence of events that would seem natural, conversation that would take you to a specific area, a technical problem that would disperse security attention, perfect timing. Phase 4, containment. Critical moment where Salameh would be physically contained. It could not seem like a violent kidnapping. Collateral would be unacceptable in such an event. It had to be fast, silent, with the appearance of a medical emergency or similar situation that did not cause immediate panic. Phase 5. Exfiltration. Remove Salameh from the hotel and transport it through Beirut to the extraction point, the most dangerous phase, where every second increased the probability of detection. Phase 6. Extraction. Naval vessel would wait on shore, ready to transport Salameh to international waters and then to Israel. Every phase is likely to fail, Zamir said during the plan's final review in Tel Aviv. And if any phase fails, the entire operation collapses. Are we comfortable with that level of risk? David Kimche presented cost-benefit analysis. If we fail, consequences are exposure of operators, diplomatic incident, potential strengthening of Salameh's position. If we succeed, capture of a central figure in an international terrorist network, access to intelligence that can dismantle future operations, demonstration that even the most protected targets eventually face justice. Rachel, Participating via secure communication from Beirut added operational perspective. Operators are ready. We've lived these identities long enough that they're no longer performances. They're genuine extensions. Infrastructure was tested. We know territory. If we are going to act, this is the most viable window we will have. Ehud was more direct. Lillehammer failed because it was rash. This is not hasty. It is the result of years of preparation. It does not eliminate risk, but mitigates it as much as operationally possible. Zamir made a decision that would define the legacy of his administration. Execute, but with absolute contingency to abort if at any time risk becomes unacceptable. I'd rather let Salami go free than cause a massacre at a charity gala. The night of December 15, 1978, arrived with typical Lebanese winter weather, cold but not uncomfortable, clear skies, Beirut displaying its duality as a city at war that still maintained pretensions of cosmopolitan normality. Rachel arrived at the hotel at 7:30 p.m., wearing understated elegance appropriate for a journalist covering elite events. His camera, genuine and functional, served a dual purpose. It justified presence and allowed him to document layout without arousing suspicion. Michelle and Layla arrived separately, each moving through security checks without incident. They found strategic positions in the main hall, not together, that would be suspicious, but distributed in such a way as to visually cover the entire space. Salami arrived at 8:15 p.m., punctual as always. 4 security guards accompanied him, 2 obvious, 2 disguised among guests. He wore an impeccable tuxedo, greeted acquaintances with the calculated cordiality of an experienced politician. Rachel watched him through the camera's viewfinder, photographing discreetly. He seemed relaxed, not completely unprotected, it never happened, but confident in an environment he considered safe. The next 2 hours were an exercise in patience. Operators monitored Salami's movements, identified patterns of his security guards, waited for an appropriate moment. At 10:30 p.m., the planned sequence began. Michel, playing a French businessman, engaged Salami in conversation about investment opportunities in post-war Lebanon. It was a topic that genuinely interested Salami. He saw economic reconstruction as a path to Palestinian political legitimacy. Conversation gradually moved them to the terrace adjacent to the main hall, a less populated, more private area where serious business could be discussed away from prying ears. Simultaneously, Layla created subtle distraction, a problem with sound equipment that attracted the attention of 2 Salami security guards, who went to investigate under pressure from event organizers. On the terrace, only Salami, Michelle, and a security guard remained. That's when Phase 4 started with timed precision months ago. Additional operator, Dr. Nassar, infiltrated as a volunteer doctor at the event, quickly approached. "Sir, sorry to interrupt, but there is a medical emergency," he began in Arabic, looking directly at the security guard. By the time security turned to attention, Michel moved with trained speed through thousands of repetitions. Obvious nonviolence, precise blow at pressure point that induced unconsciousness in seconds. Salami began to react, but Dr. Nassar was already by his side, applying a fast-acting sedative through an injection that seemed completely natural, a doctor rescuing a man in distress. Total duration of containment, 17 seconds. To any casual observer, it seemed like a genuine medical emergency. Man apparently passing out, doctor and friend helping him, security inexplicably collapsing, heart attack, stroke. Rachel appeared on the terrace, taking on the role of coordinator. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," she said with appropriate urgency, already signaling to the waiting extraction team. Salami, semi-conscious under the effect of the sedative, was quickly moved through the service exit where the ambulance, legitimate stolen hours earlier, was waiting. To the hotel's security team trying to respond, it seemed exactly what it should have looked like, a medical emergency being handled professionally. It was only when the ambulance was already 2 miles from the hotel, disappearing in complexity from the streets of Beirut, that Salame's inner circle began to realize that something was deeply wrong. And before they knew it, Operators were already running Phase 5, sailing through carefully planned routes toward the coast, where final extraction awaited. The ambulance traveled through the streets of Beirut with speed that seemed urgent but not suspicious, exactly what the team had trained. Dr. Nassar kept a monitor of Salami, who remained sedated but stable. Michel drove with the precision of someone who had memorized every turn, every checkpoint, every alternative route. Rachel was in a separate vehicle, 3 blocks behind, serving as an observer to detect any pursuit. His radio remained silent, an awakened signal that the way was clear. But at the hotel, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Salami's security guards, initially confused by the apparent medical emergency, began asking questions that had no satisfactory answers. Which hospital? Who was the doctor? Why did the ambulance leave without waiting for the event's medical team? At 11:07 p.m., 22 minutes after initial containment, an alert was issued through the Palestinian security net in Beirut. Ali Hassan Salame had been kidnapped. Vague descriptions of the ambulance, of those in charge. Checkpoints began to be activated, militias mobilized, Beirut becoming an active search zone. "Do we have persecution?" Michel asked over encrypted radio. "Negative," Rachel replied, watching through the rearview mirror. "But movement has increased. Multiple security vehicles responding. Estimated 15 minutes until coordinated blockades." Ehud, coordinating from the safe house near the port, processed information instantly. Aborting primary route. Execute Beta 3 contingency. Beta 3 contingency meant abandoning a direct maritime exfiltration plan and using a temporary hiding place. A safe house they had prepared but hoped they would not need to use. It added hours to the extraction schedule, increased exposure, but avoided direct confrontation with checkpoints that were now being established. The ambulance swerved smoothly, entering a residential neighborhood where a safe house awaited. A 2-story residence that Rachel had rented months earlier under the identity of a Canadian university professor. Quiet neighborhood, no obvious military activity. Far enough away from initial search areas. Transfer was executed quickly. Salami, still sedated, was moved to a prepared room on the 2nd floor, a space that had the appearance of a home office, but had been quietly reinforced. Windows with soundproof glass, lockable door that could not be easily forced from outside, even separate ventilation system in case tear gas was used. Dr. Nassar established medical monitoring. Stable vital signs. Sedation will last approximately 3 more hours. Then we will need an additional dose or he will awaken. Michel and 2 additional operators who had converged on the house established a security perimeter. Rachel took over communications with Tel Aviv, while Ehud coordinated next steps. "Situation?" Zamir asked over an encrypted line. "Target in custody, safe without medical complications, but the city is active. Persecution is not targeted yet. They are searching widely, they don't know specific location. Window for maritime extraction has closed temporarily." Options? We wait until activity decreases. Then we perform extraction at low attention hours, probably between 3 and 4 a.m. Or we change to the contingency of terrestrial extraction through the Christian zone. David Kimchi, listening from Tel Aviv, intervened. "International warrant has been activated. France issued a formal arrest warrant. Interpol confirmed circulation. Legal narrative is established. If we are confronted, we have justification that goes beyond a unilateral Israeli operation." It was political protection that they had painstakingly constructed, but it would only work if Salami arrived in territory where he could be formally prosecuted. Imprisoned in a safe house in Beirut, vulnerable to discovery at any time, the political value of the warrant was limited. At 2:30 a.m., intelligence analysis indicated that the search was focusing on port areas and southern routes, assuming that hijackers would attempt maritime exfiltration or movement toward the Israeli border. The area where the safe house was located remained relatively quiet. "Window is opening," Ehud transmitted, "but it is narrow. We need to move in the next 90 minutes or miss opportunity completely." Salami began to awaken at 3:15 a.m. Dr. Nassar administered additional sedative. but a lower dose. They wanted him unconscious enough for transport, but not so deeply that vital signs became worrisome. At 3:47 a.m., the extraction operation restarted. Salami was transferred to a commercial van marked as a bakery delivery service, coverage that justified movement at pre-dawn hours. Michelle drove. Rachel sailed. Dr. Nassar kept medical watch in the rear compartment. The chosen route avoided main checkpoints, using detailed knowledge of territories controlled by different factions. Here, Maronite Christians. There, neutral area. There, a sector where a specific militia operated but did not actively cooperate with Palestinian forces seeking Salami. It was a fragmented crossing through Beirut, every block potentially controlled by a different group, every corner a possible point of confrontation. But 2-year preparation, meticulous knowledge of territory, and precise timing created runner through chaos. At 4:33 a.m., they arrived at the final extraction point, a low-key dock in an area controlled by Christian militia that, through intermediaries, had been persuaded to ignore specific activity that morning in exchange for substantial financial consideration. The vessel was waiting. Not an Israeli military ship, that would be too obvious, but a Cyprus-registered commercial fishing boat, commanded by a captain who made this kind of special transport regularly and asked no inconvenient questions. Final transfer took less than 3 minutes. Salami, still semi-conscious, was moved to a hidden compartment in the hold of the boat. Operators quickly boarded. Engines started with characteristic diesel noise, and the vessel began to move slowly towards international waters. Rachel remained on the ground. Her identity as a journalist was still useful, and sudden departure would arouse suspicion. She watched the boat disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, then turned around and calmly walked back to her apartment, where she would continue living as Sarah Mitchell for another 3 weeks before executing exfiltration of her own via commercial flight. On the boat, as the Lebanese coast gradually retreated, Ehud finally allowed himself a moment of relief. Non-celebration. The operation was not yet complete until Salami was physically in Israel, but first exhalation after hours of absolute tension. Dr. Nassar monitored vital signs continuously. Stable. When sedation wears off completely, there will be confusion, possibly nausea, but no permanent damage. At 7:20 a.m., the boat crossed into international waters. At 9:15 a.m., rendezvous was executed with an Israeli naval vessel that was discreetly waiting. Final transfer took place in the open sea, away from any observation. By 11:30 a.m., Ali Hassan Salameh, the mastermind of the Munich bombings, a central figure in international Palestinian militancy, a man who had evaded capture for years, was in formal custody at an Israeli security facility, being prepared for interrogation that would last for months. In Tel Aviv, Zamir received confirmation and immediately called a leadership meeting. Operation Caesarea 17 successfully concluded. Target in custody, no operator captured, minimal collateral. But he did not demonstrate triumphalism. Now begins the more complex phase, prosecuting Salami in a way that maximizes intelligence value while minimizing diplomatic repercussions. David, this is yours. David was already coordinating with French contacts. Transfer to international custody will be executed within 72 hours. France to sue publicly. Israel withholds access for questioning. Narrative will be a joint international operation based on a legitimate warrant, not unilateral action. Rachel, still in Beirut maintaining coverage, reported local reactions. Palestinian organizations are in a state of shock, eliminating suspected collaborators internally. Arab media reported as a violation of Lebanese sovereignty, but without clear evidence linking it to Israel. Some even speculate about internal Palestinian rivalries. It was exactly ambiguity they had planned to create, operational success with no obvious fingerprint, result achieved through patience and precision instead of brute force. But while Tel Aviv processed tactical victory, Beirut seethed with consequences that would take years to fully manifest. Ali Hassan Salameh fully awoke at 2:30 p.m. on December 16, 1978, in a windowless room at an Israeli security facility located in an undisclosed area near Tel Aviv. Initial confusion quickly gave way to recognition. He had been captured, he was in custody, and years of avoiding exactly that scenario had ended in a night that had begun as a social gala. The first person he saw was David Kimche, sitting calmly in a chair on the other side of the simple metal table. Not an aggressive interrogator, not a uniformed military man. Just a middle-aged man in a discreet suit with an expression that communicated professionalism without hostility. "Mr. Salami," David said in fluent Arabic, "welcome. Before we begin, you need to know that you are in international custody based on a warrant issued by France and circulated by Interpol. He is not just a prisoner of Israel. He is the subject of international legal process." Salame, still processing residual sedatives but with a strategic mind already functioning, replied in English, "Convenient international warrant that appears just as I am captured in a clearly Israeli operation. The timing," David admitted with a faint smile, "was coordinated. But the warrant is legitimate, based on verifiable accusations related to multiple operations on French territory. You will be prosecuted in European jurisdiction, not just Israeli military. This should offer some comfort. The process will be public with appropriate legal protocols." It was a technical truth that masked operational reality. Israel retained full access for interrogation before any international transfer. But presentation mattered. Not prisoner of war held indefinitely, but criminal facing justice through recognized legal systems. In the following days, Salame was interrogated by a rotating team of intelligence analysts. Not torture, Israel, learning from past scandals and under increasing international scrutiny, had refined methods. Instead, prolonged conversations, confrontation with evidence, exploitation of psychological cracks, offers of more favorable treatment in exchange for cooperation. Salame, as expected, did not immediately cooperate. A man who had operated at strategic levels for years would not collapse under the first few hours of pressure. But the interrogation team didn't expect a quick collapse. They expected gradual erosion. Rachel, who returned from Beirut after completing her own exfiltration 3 weeks later, attended a few sessions. Her perspective was unique. He is not a fanatical ideologue. He is a strategist who believes that violence serves political purposes. If we can demonstrate that purposes will no longer be served by its silence, that networks it protects are already compromised, calculus changes. It was an approach that took months to produce results. But gradually, Salame began to provide information, not out of ideological conversion, but out of pragmatic recognition that position had fundamentally changed. Details about command structures, funding routes, international connections that linked Palestinian militancy to groups in Europe and the Middle East. Each fragment was verified, processed, used to dismantle operations that would otherwise have continued. Planned attacks were prevented not through direct confrontation, but through the removal of logistical infrastructure that made them viable. Meanwhile, the diplomatic repercussions of the capture developed in multiple layers. Lebanon formally protested the violation of sovereignty, although the protest was tempered by recognition that the Lebanese government had limited control over fragmented Beirut. Palestinian organizations denounced the action as state terrorism, but without Salame to lead the coordinated response, the response was fragmented and less effective than it could have been. CIA reacted with dissatisfaction. Salame had been a useful asset, and loss of access to the intelligence he provided created an operational gap. But publicly, the United States could not defend a figure linked to Munich, so the complaint remained in discreet diplomatic channels. Europe, particularly France, has shown public support for the legal process. International warrant provided cover that transformed unilateral action capture into multi-jurisdictional cooperation. It was a narrative that Israel had painstakingly constructed, and it worked better than they expected. In March 1979, 3 months after capture, Salame was transferred to French custody, not an end to Israeli access, Mossad analysts continued to participate in interrogations under the framework of international cooperation. But an important symbolic change that demonstrated that promises of due process were not empty. Trial in Paris became a high-profile event. Salami, represented by skilled lawyers, presented a defense that framed his actions as legitimate resistance against occupation. Prosecutors countered with detailed evidence of planned attacks that deliberately targeted civilians. The process lasted 8 months. In November 1979, Salami was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security facility. Not martyrdom through execution, not disappearance in secret prison, but public condemnation through a recognized legal system that made it difficult to portray him as the victim of arbitrary injustice. For Mossad leadership, Operation Caesarea 17 has become a case study in evolving intelligence methods. Zamir, reflecting on an internal meeting 6 months after capture, articulated lessons learned. Lillehammer taught us that rash actions cost more than they benefit. Caesarea 17 demonstrated that strategic patience, international coordination, and operational precision can achieve goals that brute force cannot. But there was also recognition of limitations. Ehud, analyzing the long-term impact, pointed out, "We captured Salami, we dismantled networks that he controlled, but we have not eliminated motivations that created these networks. New leaders will emerge, new structures will be built. We won a tactical battle, but the war continues." Rachel, whose perspective had been shaped by months living in Beirut, added a more complex dimension. Every operation like this has a cost beyond the operational. We demonstrate the ability to reach targets in hostile territory, but we also feed narratives of victimization that strengthen recruitment. Tactical success can create strategic consequences that take years to manifest. It was a central dilemma that would haunt discussions about counterterrorism for decades. Capture or selective elimination operations achieve lasting security, or do they merely perpetuate cycles of violence and retaliation? David Kimche, known for analyses that went beyond immediate victories, presented a perspective that would define future debates. There is no purely military or intelligence solution to a conflict that has deep political roots. Operations like Caesarea 17 are necessary. We cannot allow architects of massacres to operate with impunity. But they are not enough. Real security requires not only catching terrorists, but resolving conditions that produce terrorism. In the following years, Salami in prison became a more complex figure than in freedom. He gave occasional interviews where he articulated a Palestinian political vision with a sophistication that contrasted with the image of a violent terrorist. Some portrayed him as a political prisoner, others as a justly convicted criminal. Ambiguity was characteristic of conflict, where narratives competed for legitimacy. For operators who had run Caesarea 17, life went on in different trajectories. Rachel remained at the Mossad, eventually rising to leadership positions where she applied lessons from Beirut, the importance of patience, the value of understanding cultural context, the need to balance operational effectiveness with political feasibility. Ehud eventually transitioned into politics, where perspectives developed in intelligence operations informed broader approaches to national security. Michel and other operators returned to civilian lives, carrying experiences they could not share, but which fundamentally shaped how they saw the world. 10 years after the operation, in 1988, Zamir, now retired, publicly reflected on the post-Munich era of retaliatory operations. "We achieved goals that we set. We demonstrated that there would be no impunity, that Israel would respond to attacks against its citizens. But I also learned that purely operational victory is an illusion. Real security doesn't come from capturing all enemies. It comes from building systems where fewer people choose to become enemies." Salami remained imprisoned until his death in 1995 from natural causes, at the age of 55. Some Palestinians remembered him as a hero of resistance. Others saw him as a figure whose actions had harmed the Palestinian cause more than helped. Israelis remembered him primarily through the lens of Munich, the mastermind of the massacre who had finally faced justice. Operation Caesarea 17 went down in intelligence history as an example of sophisticated planning, operational patience, and precise execution. It has also become a case study in the ethical complexities of counterterrorism. It asks whether capturing or eliminating individuals solves systemic problems, or merely adds chapters to conflicts that require political solutions that go beyond intelligence capabilities. There were no simple answers, only recognition that genuine and lasting safety required not only operational excellence, but wisdom to recognize when force should be applied and when other approaches are needed. And the question remained, decades later, without definitive resolution. In a conflict where both sides see themselves as just victims and the other as illegitimate aggressor, can there be true victory through methods that perpetuate a cycle of violence and retaliation? Perhaps the real legacy of Caesarea 17 was not an answer, but an acknowledgement of what question must be constantly re-examined by each generation of leaders, operators, and citizens who inherit unresolved conflicts and choose how to respond.